Alright, this is one of my videos. You should know the drill by now. There's gonna be spoilers. This one's about the World Tree, so anything through the end of the game is fair game. Got it? Good. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is a lot of good things, but I didn't think after seeing the furry owl penguin things, the characters who can move at light speed easily, and Dahlia, that scientifically accurate would be one of them. Believe it or not, though, the World Tree, and by extension the first low orbit station, actually are completely scientifically accurate to how we would build a structure like that in real life. I first came to this realization when I was just looking up the names of different locations in the game, and I realized that the 4 levels in the World Tree that you actually get to go through before you just take the elevator up to Elysium are all named after stars in the handle of the Big Dipper. From bottom to top, the names are Benet Nash, Mizar, Alioth, and Megrez. Benet Nash is just a different name for the star Alkaid that you're seeing on screen, and Mizar does have a double star partner called Alcor, which I'm pretty sure they didn't use and changed to Alkaid, so there weren't 3 AL names in the same area, which would get confusing. But as you climb the World Tree, you actually move along the handle of the Big Dipper closer to the bowl, and by extension, closer to the pointer stars Dubhi and Mirak, which lead you towards Polaris, the North Star, which is kind of a big deal in the night sky. So that's cool, and it's all spacey themed and stuff, but what does that have to do with the World Tree actually being a viable construct? Well, it actually doesn't, that's just a cool detail that I wanted to add into the video, but that did get me looking into the names of other things related to the World Tree, and all the stuff from the Klaus time before Allrest existed and all that. I, of course, very quickly got to the first low orbit station and the whole thing with the orbital ring that's around the planet and stuff, and I decided to look up to see if those were terms the game invented, or if those were things that someone had thought about in the past and, like, made an idea for, and the developers were just using that concept to make something in the game. And that, combined with starting to watch videos from Isaac Arthur's channel, where he talks about a lot of possible new technologies and a bunch of very interesting space science and futurism related things. I'm definitely going to link the channel in the description if you're interested in what I talk about here. His channel is definitely a good place to go. But not only are the World Tree, first low orbit station, orbital ring, and everything associated with that things that someone had thought of before, but they're all scientifically viable constructs that, provided we discover 1 or 2 more super durable, super strong materials, they could actually be realistically built by the end of the century, which is the time frame given for when the Klaus incident takes place. Granted, they would all cost a lot of money, and I doubt any government in the world would be willing to do it, but in theory, we could have all of those things existing by the mysterious 20XX, in which a man presses a button and changes the fate of the world forever. Thankfully, if you do Cosmos's heart-to-heart, and choose the wondering how the World Tree was built option, you can actually find out exactly how it was constructed. And believe it or not, that's also completely accurate to how you would build something like this in real life. Before I start explaining anything else, I'm going to go quickly over all the names I'm going to call the different parts of the complex in order to avoid confusion later down the line. In a couple scenes, we see a bit of a diagram that's obviously not to scale, that shows that not only is there one ring in low orbit next to the low orbit station, but there is also another ring with its own station attached to it even further up the beanstalk elevator that's at a much further orbit. Obviously you can't go there in-game and the elevator drops you off at the first low orbit station, but there is actually something above there. Now, whether or not that's still functional in the time of Xenoblade 2 is a completely different story, and that might be a theory for another day. But the important thing is that that exists, and since the station on that ring is shown to be the size of Earth in that diagram, I think it's safe to say that that's not to scale. So basically, because this makes the whole explanation of how this works better, I'm going to assume that that outer ring is at a geostationary orbit altitude. For those of you who don't know, a geostationary orbit is just a special type of orbit where the speed at which the orbiting object is moving around its path is the same as the speed at which the body it's orbiting is rotating. So that means if you have a satellite at a geostationary orbit above Earth, it will always appear to be above the same point on Earth's surface at all times. This is very useful for various things. Communications and weather satellites use it, for instance. And in this case, if you're gonna connect a big long elevator straight up to something that's floating in space, you're probably not going to want that moving relative to the Earth's surface. Because of the way centripetal acceleration works, which has a lot to do with orbits and the like, there is a specific distance associated with a geostationary orbit. Now, because of fluctuations in the Earth's surface and different gravity over different parts of the Earth because of density and a bunch of other things that I don't need to go into right now, the actual height of a geostationary orbit changes depending on where above the planet you are, but in general, the orbital height is 37,786 kilometers above the Earth's surface, and I'm going to be using metric units for the rest of this video because it makes everything so much easier. That may sound like an obscenely far distance, but keep in mind that's less than 10% of the way to the moon, and we have sent people that far already, so it's not ridiculous to believe that you can get a larger amount of people up less than a tenth of the way. What's even easier to comprehend is the first low orbit station, because low orbits top out at 2,000 kilometers. After that, it's considered a medium orbit, and out past geostationary, it's considered a high orbit. But there's no real need to specify an exact height of where the first low orbit station actually is, so I'm not too concerned about that, but just for the sake of clarity and based on the size that the planet appears to be from the station, I'm gonna make a little guess and say that it's about the height of the International Space Station, so in between 350 to 450 kilometers. We'll just say it's 400 to be easy. At that altitude, the big important thing is the first low orbit station, which is called Rhadamanthus, after the Judge of the Dead and right-hand man of the King of Elysium in Greek mythology. Very fitting name. And there's an orbital ring there too, which I'll just refer to as the Rhadamanthus Ring. Leading up to the Rhadamanthus station is the World Tree, which I'm going to say ends at the top of Megrez, aka the level where the arena where you fought Jin for the last time in Malthus is, and anything above that is just the elevator, so that will be called the Beanstalk. The Beanstalk leads out past the top of the World Tree, up through Rhadamanthus, and all the way up to the higher geostationary station, which isn't given a name in-game, but I'm going to choose to call Cronus, after the King of Elysium, who Rhadamanthus was the right-hand man to. Us physicists and astronomers like our Greek and Roman mythological names for things, so this works, and the orbital ring around there I'll just call the Cronus Ring. With all that out of the way, we can finally start actually listening to Cosmos' explanation about how the damn thing was built. She starts out by saying that a satellite is sent up to geostationary orbit above the planet. Again, why I'm saying that Cronus Station is at geostationary. It then lowers a cable down towards the planet and extends a weight out in the opposite direction to use as a counterweight. And that once the cable reaches the ground, they can begin sending materials up towards the satellite and eventually creating the World Tree around that cable. This is a device known as a space elevator. The name and the concept sound super fantastical, but believe it or not, the physics behind it are relatively simple, and the only reason we haven't been able to build one yet is more an engineering-related concern than a physics one. Basically, the concept behind the space elevator is that the upper end of the cable is at or above a geostationary orbit level, so it's orbiting geostationary and the entire cable is hanging down. So you'd be thinking, okay, but won't it bend and flop around with the different gravity and wind and stuff? Well, the way it works is that if it's that specific length or longer, then the gravity pulling down on the cable and the centrifugal force on it from rotating, yes, centrifugal force doesn't actually exist technically, but on objects that are rotating, like the cable would be around the Earth, it does act like it's under a force pulling up, and those two combined will create a tension in the cable that will keep it completely taut and floating above the same point on Earth's surface at all times. It's pretty cool, but the only reason we can't build one is because we haven't created any materials yet that are capable of withstanding the weight of 33,000 kilometers of itself under stress, and anything we can think of so far will snap under only a couple hundred. That being said, all we really need is a way to mass produce something like really strong carbon nanotubes or graphene or something, and we could be able to make a space elevator pretty easily. And believe it or not, the way that they used it to then ferry materials upwards actually is how you would use something. The main cost of any sort of spaceflight or sending things into space is just getting it out of Earth's atmosphere. Once you're in space and you don't have to worry about air resistance and the gravity's a lot weaker and stuff, you really don't need nearly as much fuel to do anything. So if you have literally an elevator taking you out past the atmosphere all the way up to 33,000 kilometers, you don't have to pay nearly as much to send something into space. According to Cosmos, once the elevator was in place, the next step was to use it to send materials up to the satellite and begin constructing the world tree, while sending the counterweight further and further out into space. The reason you need a counterweight in a space elevator system is because if the center of mass of the system goes below the geostationary line, the forces won't balance out and things will not go very well. And of course, if you're doing something like putting a car on your cable to send it up, you're going to be adding mass lower down to the system, so you need to move the weight further out to change where the center of mass is. It's because of this, and the general bulk of the lower world tree, and the fact that there's a whole lower orbital ring, that makes me think that Cronus Station itself might actually be the counterweight, and that it's past the geostationary line in such a way where the center of mass is above it. But again, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to just say Cronus Station is at geostationary orbit, the ring around it is a ring at that level, and that the counterweight is even further out into space. Possibly they just sent something light really, really far, or my best guess is they somehow captured an asteroid and tied that up to the cable, because in general, asteroids are being looked at as a way to counterweight really, really heavy-duty space elevators used for mass transit and the like. And believe it or not, besides the orbital rings themselves, that's the biggest, most difficult concept to pull off right now. Once you've got a space elevator, you can send materials up to build a humongous station up at the top of it relatively easily. And yeah, we haven't really built big space stations ourselves yet, but we do know how to make them, and I'm sure with advanced technology we'll be able to do things like the huge windows and floor and stuff where you could see the planet straight through all of them. That's in Radiamantha Station, and things like the huge pressurized habitat unit of Elysium, and being able to scale that up and put it up at Cronus Station. Granted, gravity at the height of Cronus Station would be incredibly low compared to the way it is on the surface of Earth, so you'd need to mimic it in some way to have people comfortably live up there and not be almost floating around the entire time. But I'm sure that is possible. There are several theories on how you could do that in some sort of space habitat, so I'm not saying that that's an inaccuracy, if anything, especially since we don't even know if that's a regularly populated station. It might just have elevator access up there so you can go and check on the robots if you really need to. At the height of Radiamantha Station, assuming it's around ISS height, gravity will actually still be 86% of what it is on the surface of the Earth on average, so that's reasonably livable, and someone could probably get used to that just biologically over time, and if not, you can also do the artificial gravity thing there too. Of course, you can't actually feel the lessened gravity in-game, but that kind of makes sense since this isn't a platformer and there's no real need to do that level design or combat-wise since you're not jumping in combat, but that's besides the point. Once the space stations are built, you will probably want to build an entire building around the base of your space elevator to keep the bottom of it secure and maybe house customs or something for people living in space, or just some sort of ground control that can communicate with the two stations and stuff, general science facilities, perhaps you even built the space elevator out of the base of an existing lab of some sort, and that's of course where the world tree comes in. It's pretty tall, but not unreasonably so, where it would collapse under its own weight without also being connected to the space elevator. Obviously we can't really tell whether or not the world tree is also partially supported by the beanstalk and the elevator and stuff, but if it isn't, it's still reasonably possible that you can make a regular building that height too, and just build it around the base of the elevator. The vegetation around the world tree, I don't know, I think that's just something that kind of grew there over the countless millennia since the whole incident happened. I doubt that was actually built into it. The glyphs around the top that people started to think were leaves or something, those are obviously artificial. I have no idea why you need that. My guess would be, oh, that's some sort of light that you use to avoid planes flying into it. That actually kind of makes sense to me. You definitely don't want planes crashing into your space elevator. It's just kind of a thing you'd want to watch out for. So that actually sort of makes sense to me. Believe it or not, we've got through how almost all of these things could be very reasonably built, provided you had the technology and obviously the energy and cost, which I'm assuming the conduit existing and providing unlimited energy kind of helped with that stuff. But the one remaining thing is the orbital rings. Now, this is really interesting because the orbital ring was first hypothesized by Nikola Tesla back in the 1870s as written in his autobiography. So this is an idea that goes pretty far back, like before the age of spaceflight, so you kind of know that this is actually possible. If you just build a really big circle and try to ask the Earth to hula hoop with it, you're gonna run into a few problems. Like I said before, gravity is not constant around the Earth's surface, and there are going to be certain imperfections in the construction of the loop itself. Plus, it will start to sag under its own weight, and you really don't want that to happen if the whole point of your ring is an orbital ring and not a bulgy crashing into the surface ring. So the solution is again to do what the space elevator does and rely on centrifugal force. If you spin the loop itself, you'll produce an effective outward force on it that will again counteract gravity and keep the loop stationary in its same place. It is technically the best idea to do this over the equator, but based on a road sign in Moratha, as I've said before, the World Tree is probably in the United States, so they just decided to do it at a different latitude, which is perfectly fine. You can do this anywhere. It's just, quote-unquote, the most recommended to make your first one over the equator if you really want to do this. Of course, the big problem is you've got a really, really fast spinning circle in space, so how do you use that for anything? It's spinning so fast you can't really attach stuff to it very well. It'll just get flung around constantly. And you'll get shredded if you try to touch it yourself because of how fast it's going. So what is the solution for it? Well, you have to make the spinning thing a wire that you can put electric current through and then generate a magnetic field around. If you do that, you can then put a sort of metal sheath around the wire in such a way where it will be supported around it by the magnetic field being put out by the current of the wire. You can actually do this with current technology. It's just you need to build stuff and get it out into space and stuff. Then once you've got that, you could start adding more wires together, or just use a really big wire to begin with, and get something that's actually capable of supporting a pretty big structure. And once you got that, the outer casing, the only thing spinning is the actual wire, so the outer casing is completely stationary, being held up by magnetic forces. And you could just put a space elevator through that. Attach it to an elevator that exists already, send cables down to the surface, build habitats, like Elysium, and just do things using the ring. It's a ridiculously cool thing that you could use for so many different things. Shipping things for an extremely cheap amount of money. The possibilities are insane. If you want to learn more, I'd highly suggest watching Isaac Arthur's video on it again. Really cool, but the big thing is, you can make an orbital ring and have it work properly. You can even use the wire to supply power to the station and stuff, all that sort of thing. And yeah, both rings are completely feasible by this. Again, since the rings themselves are stationary, you can do things like build habitats on top of them themselves, use them for research outposts or whatever, and if I were to guess, that's probably what they use the Cronus ring for. The Radamanthus ring appears to be completely just used for experiments, so it's my guess that Elysium's the only real habitation, and that's probably for the families of the scientists that are actually working in the station itself. But yeah, from what I can tell, just based on the cutscenes of the experiment going off, I'm pretty sure that the Radamanthus ring was also used as a particle accelerator, the size of the Earth plus the height of the ring. Now, when you've got conduit powering all your stuff, and again, the conduit is the only justification I'm using for the fact that they actually have the energy and the funds to build all this stuff within the 21st century. So if you've got all that energy, shooting particles around something hundreds, if not thousands of times the size of the biggest particle accelerators we got around today, you can kinda see how Klaus blew stuff up so quickly. So, next time you're playing Xenoblade 2, and you look up at the World Tree, remember, blades might not be real, the Cloud Sea might not be real, giant mechs might not be real, sassy Welsh cat-eared girls might not be real, your bird child might not be real, but the World Tree, you could totally do that if you had enough money. And until next time, this is Luxon, signing off.